The small diner on Kepler Station buzzed with the usual mix of traders, miners, and travelers passing through the outer rim. Steam rose from cheap synthetic coffee, while the air recyclers hummed their constant mechanical song. In a corner booth sat a figure most would dismiss as just another spacer down on his luck. Marcus Chun kept his head low, worn jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. 3 months of deliberately shabby clothes and careful body language had transformed the most powerful man in human space into someone completely invisible. The Dragon Emperor of the Terran hegemony had vanished into the crowds, and in his place sat a tired-looking freight hauler nursing his third cup of coffee. The decision to disappear had not been easy. 20 years of ruling an empire spanning 47 star systems, commanding fleets that made alien civilizations tremble, and Marcus had never felt more isolated. Every word was analyzed, every gesture recorded, every human interaction filtered through layers of protocol and political calculation. He needed to remember what his people were really like when they thought no one important was watching. The diner door chimed as another customer entered. Marcus glanced up from his datapad, where he pretended to study shipping manifests, and watched a young woman in a server's uniform hurry toward the kitchen. She moved with quick efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her uniform clean but clearly secondhand. Sarah Martinez had been working the evening shift for 2 weeks now, ever since Marcus started his regular visits to this unremarkable establishment. She served him coffee with a polite smile, never lingering for conversation, never asking questions. Perfect anonymity. Tonight felt different, though. Marcus noticed Sarah glancing toward the kitchen more frequently than usual, her movements slightly more rushed. When she brought his usual order, a simple protein bar and more coffee, her hands trembled slightly. "Rough day?" Marcus asked quietly, keeping his voice in the lower registers he had practiced to hide his natural commanding tone. Sarah looked surprised that he had spoken. Most of the regulars barely acknowledged the serving staff. "Just tired," she said with a forced smile. "Let me know if you need anything else." But Marcus had spent decades reading people, and something in her eyes suggested more than fatigue. He watched her work for the next hour, cataloging small details. The way she kept checking the time, how she positioned herself near the kitchen entrance, the careful way she wrapped leftover bread from empty tables. When the dinner rush died down, Marcus saw his opportunity. Sarah was clearing tables near his booth when she stumbled slightly, sending a plate clattering to the floor. As she bent to clean up the mess, several rolls scattered under nearby tables. "I've got those," Marcus said, kneeling to help gather the fallen bread. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, but when their eyes met, Marcus saw something that made his chest tighten. Fear, not of him, but of something else entirely. As they both reached for the last roll, Marcus noticed something that stopped him cold. Sarah's hand was thin, too thin, with the slight tremor that came from chronic hunger. But more than that, he saw her slip one of the gathered rolls into her jacket pocket with practiced stealth. Marcus had seen enough warfare to recognize the signs of a population under stress. He had studied enough intelligence reports to understand desperation. But seeing it in the flesh in one of his own citizens hit him like a physical blow. "Miss," he said quietly, "everything all right?" Sarah's face went pale. She thought she had been caught stealing. The bread was going to be thrown out anyway," she stammered. "I didn't think." "Hey, no judgment here," Marcus said gently. "We all do what we have to do." But his mind was racing. This was Kepler Station, a major hub in the Terran trade network. It should be prosperous. Citizens here should have access to basic nutrition programs, employment opportunities, social safety nets. All the systems his administration had put in place to ensure human prosperity throughout the empire. Sarah relaxed slightly at his understanding tone. "Thank you for being kind about it. Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, settling back into his booth and gesturing for her to sit if she wanted. "Just curious about life out here on the rim. I'm between jobs myself, considering settling down somewhere." It was a careful lie, designed to encourage conversation without seeming like an interrogation. Sarah glanced around the nearly empty diner, then slipped into the seat across from him. "Life out here is different," she said carefully. "Not like the inner systems where everything's automated and provided for. Out here, you work or you don't eat." Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach. The employment programs, though, the universal basic provisions, those should be available anywhere in Terran space. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. On paper, maybe reality's different. The local administrators decide who qualifies, who gets priority. If you don't have connections, if you're not from an established family. She shrugged. You find other ways to get by. Other ways. Multiple jobs when you can find them. Stretching everything as far as possible. Making sure nothing goes to waste. Her hand unconsciously moved to the pocket where she had hidden the bread roll. Marcus had to work to keep his expression neutral. "Sounds tough. Could be worse," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "At least here on Kepler we have some opportunities. I hear the agricultural colonies are really struggling since the shipping costs went up." "Shipping costs. New security taxes," Sarah explained. "After the Zephyrian raids increased, the military needed more funding for patrols. Makes sense, but it means everything costs more now. Food, medicine, equipment. The outer colonies can barely afford to ship their goods to market, and we can barely afford to import what we need." Marcus felt the world shifting around him. The Zephyrian raids had been a minor concern in the intelligence briefings, handled efficiently by local fleet commanders. The additional security measures were logical, necessary responses to protect human shipping. But no one had told him about the economic cascade effects rippling through the outer systems. "You seem to know a lot about economics," Marcus observed. Sarah smiled ruefully. "Used to work in colonial administration. Before the budget cuts. That's actually how I ended up here. Lost my position when they consolidated the Outer Rim offices. Now I serve coffee and try to make rent." The casual way she delivered this information made it even more devastating. A qualified administrator reduced to service work, struggling to feed herself, all because of policy decisions made in distant boardrooms and council chambers. Decisions Marcus himself had approved. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "everyone knows the Dragon Emperor cares about human prosperity. His policies are supposed to protect us. But somewhere between the capital and out here, things get lost in translation. The spirit of the law gets buried under bureaucracy and local politics." Marcus had to focus on his breathing. "You think the Emperor knows about conditions out here?" "How could he?" Sarah said. "He's probably surrounded by advisors telling him everything's perfect. That's how it works with powerful people. They hear what people think they want to hear." She was right, and Marcus knew it. How many reports had crossed his desk, assuring him that Outer Rim integration was proceeding smoothly? How many administrators had painted rosy pictures of colonial prosperity while citizens like Sarah struggled to survive? "What would you tell him if you could?" Marcus asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. "That we're not asking for handouts. We want to work, to contribute, to build something meaningful. But we need the systems to actually work the way they're supposed to. We need administrators who care more about doing their jobs than protecting their positions." She paused, then added, "And maybe that leaders should come see things for themselves sometimes instead of just reading reports." The irony was not lost on Marcus. Here he was seeing things for himself and discovering that everything he thought he knew was incomplete at best. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus said. "The bread you took, is that for tonight's dinner?" Sarah looked embarrassed, but nodded. "I eat here during my shift when I can, but on my days off," she shrugged. "Food's expensive, and I'm saving every credit I can to get transport to the inner systems. Better opportunities there, or so I hope." Marcus realized she was planning to leave, to abandon her home system because it could not provide her with a decent life. How many others were making the same choice? How many citizens was the Empire losing not to alien conquest or natural disaster, but to simple administrative incompetence? The inner systems are nice, Marcus said carefully, but maybe things could improve out here too, with the right changes. Maybe, Sarah said, but her tone suggested she had little faith in change coming to the Outer Rim. The Dragon Emperor seems like a decent man, from what we hear, but he's got an entire galaxy to worry about. Places like Kepler Station probably don't even register as important. If only she knew, Marcus thought. Kepler Station was about to become the most important place in the Empire, because it was showing him truths he had never been allowed to see. The diner's closing chime sounded, and Sarah stood to finish her cleanup duties. "Thanks for listening," she said. "Most people don't really want to hear about other people's problems." "Thank you for sharing," Marcus replied. "Sometimes talking to someone helps put things in perspective." As Sarah went about her closing routine, Marcus sat in his booth and tried to process what he had learned. Not just the facts, though those were damning enough, but the human reality behind the policy failures. The quiet dignity of someone working hard despite a system that had failed them. The resignation of intelligent people forced into circumstances beneath their abilities. He thought about the council meeting scheduled for next week, where administrators would present their quarterly reports on Outer Rim prosperity. Reports that would undoubtedly show all targets met, all programs functioning effectively, all citizens thriving under enlightened imperial governance. Reports that were apparently complete fabrications. Marcus left a generous tip and walked out into the artificial night of the station's commercial district. The corridors were cleaner than he had expected, the security adequate, the basic infrastructure functional. To a casual inspection, Kepler Station would seem like a success story. But Marcus was beginning to understand that the real stories were hidden in details. In the tremor of hungry hands. In the casual acceptance of systemic failure. In the quiet desperation of citizens who believed their government had simply forgotten them. As he made his way back to his modest quarters, Marcus began forming a plan. He had learned more in one evening of honest conversation than in months of official briefings. But this was just the beginning. If he was going to fix the problems he was discovering, he needed to understand their full scope. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper. He would ask more questions, observe more closely, and prepare to confront the possibility that his empire was failing its people in ways he had never imagined. The Dragon Emperor had disappeared into the crowds to find the truth about his people. What he was finding was forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about the civilization he had spent his life building. Marcus arrived at the diner early the next morning, claiming a different booth where he could observe the breakfast rush. His server's uniform was wrinkled from sleeping in it, and dark circles under her eyes suggested another restless night. But Sarah Martinez moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency, treating each customer with professional courtesy regardless of how they treated her. He watched her handle a difficult table of cargo haulers who complained loudly about everything from the coffee temperature to the speed of service. Sarah remained calm and polite even when one man made a crude comment about her appearance. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily, old instincts flaring, but he forced himself to remain still. The Dragon Emperor might have had such men disciplined for disrespecting a citizen, but Marcus the freight hauler could only observe and learn. When the breakfast crowd thinned, Sarah approached his table with a coffee pot. "Back again? You must really like our coffee." "It's growing on me," Marcus said. "Actually, I was hoping to ask you more about life on Kepler. I'm thinking seriously about settling here, but I want to understand what I'd be getting into." Sarah refilled his cup and glanced around the diner. The morning supervisor was in the back office, and no other customers were within earshot. "What do you want to know?" "Yesterday you mentioned budget cuts in colonial administration. How bad did that get?" Sarah sat down across from him, grateful for a moment off her feet. "Pretty bad. The Outer Rim Governance Council decided that smaller stations could be managed remotely from regional centers. Cut costs by 60%, they said. But did it work?" "Depends on what you mean by work," Sarah said with a bitter smile. "If you mean saving money in the short term, sure. If you mean actually governing effectively," she shrugged. "How can someone on Centauri Prime make good decisions about life on Kepler Station?" They don't understand local conditions, local needs, local people. Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The efficiency reports he had approved showed cost savings and streamlined operations. No one had mentioned the human cost of those efficiencies. What about the social safety nets? Marcus asked. The employment assistance, the basic nutrition programs? They exist, Sarah said carefully. Technically. But accessing them is another story. You have to file applications through the remote system, which means dealing with automated reviewers and administrators who've never set foot on this station. If your situation doesn't fit their standard categories, you're out of luck. Have you tried applying? Sarah laughed quietly. 3 times. First application was rejected because my former position was classified as voluntary termination rather than economic displacement. Second time, they said I made too much in tips to qualify for assistance. Third time, the system glitched and lost my file completely. Marcus had to work to keep his voice steady. That's unacceptable. Is it though? Sarah asked. From the government's perspective, I have a job. I am housed. I'm not starving in the streets. By their metrics, I'm a success story. They don't track quality of life, just basic survival indicators. And the local officials? Can't they help with the bureaucracy? Sarah's expression darkened. The local officials who are left are more interested in managing their own positions than helping citizens. Station Administrator Knox, for example. He spends most of his time writing reports that make everything sound perfect. As long as the numbers look good on paper, he keeps his job and his nice apartment in the administrative sector. Marcus made a mental note of the name. Administrator Knox would be receiving a very thorough review in the near future. The thing is, Sarah continued, I think most people at the top genuinely want to help. The policies sound good when you read them, but implementation is everything, and that's where the system breaks down. She was being remarkably generous, Marcus thought. After everything she had endured, she still gave the benefit of the doubt to leaders who had failed her. What would fix it? Marcus asked. Accountability, Sarah said immediately. Real oversight. People in charge who actually understand local conditions and care about results, not just reports. And maybe some recognition that one-size-fits-all solutions don't work across an entire galaxy. The diner door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a family entering, 2 adults and a young child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The parents looked tired and stressed, their clothes clean but patched in several places. Excuse me, Sarah said, standing to greet the new customers. Marcus watched her interact with the family, noting how her demeanor softened when she spoke to the child. The parents ordered carefully, obviously calculating costs, while their daughter looked longingly at the pastry display. After seating the family, Sarah returned to Marcus's table. Friends of yours? He asked. The Hendersons. Tom lost his job when the mining operation scaled back. Linda works part-time at the recycling center, but it's not enough to cover their old apartment. They're staying in temporary housing now. Marcus observed the family more closely. The father sat with the posture of a man accustomed to hard work, while the mother kept a protective arm around their daughter. They were obviously struggling, but there was no self-pity in their bearing, only the quiet determination of people dealing with difficult circumstances. What happened to the mining operation? Marcus asked. Same story as everything else. Efficiency improvements. They brought in automated systems that could do the work of 20 miners. Good for productivity, not so good for employment. The company saved money. The government got better output numbers, and 20 families lost their income. Marcus felt the familiar tension between his 2 identities. The Dragon Emperor understood the need for technological advancement and economic efficiency. But Marcus the freight hauler was seeing the human cost of those improvements in real time. Are there retraining programs? On paper, yes. In reality, the nearest facility is 3 systems away, and the waiting list is 2 years long. Tom's been applying for anything he can find, but competition is fierce when you're competing against automation. The diner door opened again, and this time Marcus recognized the newcomer from his intelligence briefings. Commissioner Walsh, the Regional Trade Authority representative, swept in with the air of someone accustomed to deference. He was well-dressed, well-fed, and clearly operated in very different circles than the diner's usual clientele. "Sarah," Walsh called out without looking at her, "coffee. Black. And whatever passes for a decent breakfast in this place." Marcus watched Sarah's face carefully. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of resentment before she composed herself. "Right away, Commissioner." As Sarah hurried to serve the trade official, Marcus studied Walsh more closely. The man's clothes were expensive, his accessories spoke of comfortable living, and his attitude suggested someone completely disconnected from the struggles of ordinary citizens. Walsh barely acknowledged Sarah when she brought his order, treating her as furniture rather than a person. He spent his time reviewing data pads and making calls, speaking loudly enough for the entire diner to hear his discussions of shipping quotas and productivity metrics. "The numbers are excellent," Walsh was saying into his communicator. "Kepler Station is exceeding all efficiency targets. The automation initiatives are paying dividends, and citizen satisfaction remains within acceptable parameters." Marcus almost choked on his coffee. Citizen satisfaction within acceptable parameters? Based on what data? Sarah returned to his table after serving Walsh, her jaw tight with controlled frustration. "Let me guess," Marcus said quietly. "He's the one who reports on local conditions?" "Regional Trade Authority," Sarah confirmed. "Responsible for economic oversight and citizen welfare assessments." "Does he ever actually talk to citizens?" "Define talk," Sarah said dryly. "He asks questions sometimes. Carefully phrased questions designed to get specific answers. He's never interested in hearing about problems that don't have simple solutions." Marcus watched Walsh for another few minutes, noting how the man's presence changed the entire atmosphere of the diner. Other customers became more subdued, staff moved more carefully, and conversations dropped to whispers. This was someone who wielded power over their lives, but clearly had no real understanding of those lives. When Walsh finished his breakfast, he left credits on the table without looking at Sarah again. "No tip," Marcus noted. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the diner visibly eased. "Charming fellow," Marcus observed. "He's not evil," Sarah said, surprising him with her fairness. "Just completely out of touch. He genuinely believes he's doing a good job, because his reports show what his superiors want to see. But he only sees what fits his preconceptions. And what do his reports say about conditions here? That Kepler Station is a model of efficient governance and citizen prosperity. That the transition to automated systems has been seamlessly managed. That social services are meeting all identified needs." Marcus felt a familiar anger building, but it was directed as much at himself as at Walsh. How many similar reports had he read and approved? How many times had he congratulated administrators on their excellent work based on metrics that apparently bore no resemblance to reality? "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "if you could change 3 things about how the station is governed, what would they be?" She considered the question seriously. "First, I'd require administrators to actually live here for at least 6 months before taking their positions. You can't govern a place you don't understand. Second, I'd change the reporting systems to track real outcomes, not just numerical targets. And third," she paused, looking out at the dining area where the Henderson family was sharing a single pastry among the 3 of them. "Third, I'd remember that every policy decision affects real people. Every efficiency improvement, every budget cut, every new regulation touches someone's life directly. The people making those decisions should be required to see those consequences." Marcus followed her gaze to the Henderson family. The daughter was carefully dividing her portion of pastry into smaller pieces, making it last longer. The parents watched her with expressions of love mixed with quiet heartbreak. "The current system isn't malicious," Sarah continued. "It's just disconnected. People at the top make decisions based on abstract data, and people at the bottom deal with the concrete results. But there's no feedback loop, no real accountability." "What if there was?" Marcus asked. What if the people at the top had to see the real results of their decisions? Sarah looked at him curiously. That's an interesting hypothetical. But how would that work in practice? The Dragon Emperor can't visit every station personally. Maybe he could visit some of them, Marcus suggested. Maybe he could see for himself what's working and what isn't. Even if he did, Sarah said, would anyone tell him the truth? Or would they just show him what they thought he wanted to see? It was a sobering question. Marcus thought about his own experience of the last 2 days. If he had arrived as the Dragon Emperor, with full ceremony and official welcomes, would he have learned anything useful? Or would Administrator Knox have stage-managed every encounter to present an illusion of success? Maybe the trick would be to visit without anyone knowing who he was, Marcus said. Sarah smiled at the thought. Anonymous inspections? That would certainly shake things up. Can you imagine Administrator Knox's face if he found out the Dragon Emperor had been eating in this diner? Marcus could imagine it quite clearly, and the thought gave him considerable satisfaction. The lunch rush was beginning, and Sarah had to return to her duties. But as Marcus sat in his booth, watching her work and observing the daily rhythms of life on Kepler Station, he began to understand the scope of the challenge before him. The problems were not limited to incompetent administrators or failed policies. They were systemic, built into the very structure of how the empire was organized. Distance bred disconnection. Efficiency metrics ignored human costs. Good intentions got lost in bureaucratic complexity. But Marcus was beginning to see solutions too. Not quick fixes or simple policy changes, but fundamental reforms that could reconnect the government with the governed. Ways to ensure that the people making decisions understood their consequences. Systems that would prioritize human flourishing over abstract efficiency. As he watched Sarah navigate the challenges of her daily life with dignity and grace, Marcus felt something he had not experienced in years. Purpose. Real purpose, rooted in the lives of actual citizens rather than the theoretical constructs of governance. The Dragon Emperor had work to do, but first, Marcus the freight hauler had more to learn. On his third day at the diner, Marcus arrived to find Sarah's usual shift covered by someone else. The replacement server, an older woman with tired eyes, explained that Sarah had called in sick. Something about the way she said it made Marcus suspicious. "Is she all right?" he asked. "As all right as anyone can be when they can't afford medical care," the woman replied with practiced cynicism. "Girl's been working double shifts for weeks." Her body finally said enough. Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Medical care isn't available?" "Oh, it's available," the server said, refilling his coffee with perhaps more force than necessary. "If you can afford it, if you can navigate the insurance bureaucracy, if you can get an appointment before whatever's wrong with you gets worse." She moved away before Marcus could ask more questions, but the seed of worry had been planted. After finishing his breakfast, he made his way to Sarah's apartment building, information he had discreetly obtained from diner employment records. The residential section where Sarah lived was functional, but grim. Narrow corridors, recycled air that smelled faintly of industrial lubricants, and walls that had not seen fresh paint in years. Marcus found her door and knocked gently. "Sarah? It's Marcus from the diner. I heard you weren't feeling well." There was a long pause before the door opened. Sarah stood there in a worn bathrobe, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" "I was worried about you," he said simply. "Can I come in?" Sarah's apartment was smaller than Marcus had expected, and painfully neat. Everything was clean and carefully organized, but the furniture was old, the walls bare except for a single photograph of Sarah with two older people who were probably her parents. The kitchen consisted of a small food preparation unit and a single cabinet. "You really didn't need to come," Sarah said, settling carefully into her only chair. "It's just a fever. It'll pass." But Marcus could see this was more than a simple fever. Sarah moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying to hide weakness, and her breathing was slightly labored. "Have you seen a doctor?" Sarah laughed, but it turned into a coughing fit that left her gasping. "Do you know what it costs to see a doctor on this station?" 2 weeks' wages minimum. And that's just for consultation. Marcus felt the Dragon Emperor's fury rising, but he pushed it down. Right now, Sarah needed help, not political outrage. What about the station's medical services? Emergency care only, Sarah explained. Unless you're dying, you wait. And you pay. Marcus looked around the sparse apartment, seeing it with new eyes. This was what life looked like for someone working full-time in the supposedly prosperous Terran Empire. This was the reality behind the efficiency reports and satisfaction metrics. Sarah, he said carefully, let me help. I've got some savings set aside. We can get you proper medical care. I can't accept that, Sarah said immediately. You're just a freight hauler like me. You can't afford it either. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was Marcus Chun, ruler of 47 star systems, being told by a sick citizen that he couldn't afford to help her because he was too poor. The gap between his public role and his current identity had never felt so surreal. I've been saving for a while, Marcus said. And honestly, what good is money if you can't help someone who needs it? Sarah studied his face, trying to understand his motivations. Why would you do that? You barely know me. Because it's the right thing to do, Marcus said. And because someone in your situation shouldn't have to choose between medical care and eating. After a long moment, Sarah nodded. All right, but I'll pay you back. We'll worry about that later, Marcus said. Right now, let's focus on getting you better. The medical center was a revelation in institutional dysfunction. The waiting area was crowded with people who clearly had been there for hours, many of them looking sicker than when they had arrived. A single receptionist handled check-ins while managing appointment scheduling, insurance verification, and payment processing. When Marcus approached the desk with Sarah, the receptionist barely looked up from her screen. Name? Sarah Martinez. We'd like to schedule an appointment with a doctor. Emergency or routine? Marcus looked at Sarah, who was leaning heavily against the counter. She has a fever, difficulty breathing, and has been sick for days. Sounds routine. Next available appointment is in 6 days. That'll be 400 credits deposit, plus insurance verification. 6 days? Marcus said. She's clearly ill now. Emergency treatment is available immediately, the receptionist said in a bored tone. Emergency rates apply. 1,500 credits up front, plus additional charges for any treatment provided. Marcus felt his careful cover identity straining under the pressure of pure outrage. 1,500 credits was more than Sarah made in a month. For citizens of the most advanced human civilization in galactic history, this was unconscionable. We'll take the emergency treatment, Marcus said. The receptionist finally looked up, surprised. Most people in this district could not afford emergency rates. Payment in advance. Marcus transferred the credits without hesitation, but he was making mental notes of every failure he witnessed. The understaffed reception area, the artificial scarcity of medical appointments, the punitive cost structure that forced citizens to choose between health and financial stability. The emergency medical bay was efficient but impersonal. Sarah was diagnosed with a respiratory infection that had progressed due to exhaustion and stress. The doctor, a competent but overworked professional, prescribed medication and bed rest. This is easily treatable, the doctor explained to Marcus while Sarah rested. But it could have been serious if left untreated much longer. Why did she wait so long to seek care? Cost, Marcus said simply. The doctor's expression darkened. I see that too often. People waiting until they're desperate because they can't afford early intervention. It's medically counterproductive and morally questionable. What would you change about the system? Marcus asked. The doctor looked around to make sure they weren't overheard. Honestly, the whole cost structure is designed wrong. We spend more money treating advanced conditions that could have been prevented with early, affordable care. But the bureaucrats who set policy don't understand medical economics. Another piece of the systemic puzzle. Even the medical professionals understood the problems, but they had no mechanism to influence policy decisions made by distant administrators. Back at Sarah's apartment, Marcus helped her settle in with her medications. The treatment had already begun to improve her breathing, but she was still weak from days of fighting the infection. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said as Marcus prepared to leave. "What you did today, most people wouldn't have cared enough." "Most people care," Marcus said. "They just don't always have the ability to help." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But you know what's strange? The whole time we were at the medical center, I kept thinking about what you said yesterday. About the Dragon Emperor visiting places incognito." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Oh, I was imagining what would happen if he was there, seeing what we saw. The wait times, the cost barriers, the way people are forced to choose between health and financial survival. Do you think he'd understand how broken the system is?" "I think anyone with eyes would understand," Marcus said carefully. "But would he care enough to fix it? Or would he just see it as an unfortunate necessity, the cost of running an empire?" Marcus sat down across from Sarah, considering his answer carefully. "What do you think?" "I want to believe he'd care," Sarah said. "The stories about him suggest he's a decent man who genuinely wants to serve humanity. But he's so far removed from ordinary life. How could he understand what it's like to choose between medicine and rent?" "Maybe," Marcus said slowly, "the challenge is finding ways to bridge that distance, to make sure leaders understand the real impact of their decisions. That would require admitting that the current reporting systems are inadequate," Sarah pointed out. "And that would mean admitting that a lot of important people have been wrong about a lot of important things." She was right, of course. The reforms Marcus was beginning to envision would require acknowledging that the Empire's governance systems were fundamentally flawed. That efficiency reports were meaningless if they ignored human costs. That citizen welfare could not be measured by abstract metrics. "Sometimes," Marcus said, "being wrong is the first step toward being right." Sarah smiled weakly. "You're very philosophical for a freight hauler." "I've had time to think," Marcus said. "Long hours in hyperspace give you perspective on things." Over the next few hours, as Sarah rested and Marcus kept her company, their conversation ranged across the challenges facing Outer Rim communities. Sarah painted a picture of systemic neglect disguised as efficient governance. Resources flowing inward to core systems while frontier regions struggled with inadequate infrastructure and declining opportunities. "The irony," Sarah said, "is that places like Kepler Station are vital to the Empire's economy. We're the ones mining the raw materials, growing the food, maintaining the shipping routes that keep everything connected. But we're treated like afterthoughts in policy discussions. What would meaningful representation look like?" Marcus asked. "Direct communication channels," Sarah said immediately. "Ways for local communities to report problems and have them actually addressed. Regular oversight that focuses on outcomes, not just numbers. And maybe some recognition that local officials should be accountable to the people they serve, not just their supervisors in distant star systems." Marcus was taking mental notes furiously. These were exactly the kinds of insights he needed to design effective reforms. "Most importantly," Sarah continued, "there needs to be recognition that frontier communities aren't failed core systems. We have different needs, different challenges, different strengths. One-size-fits-all policies don't work across such diverse environments." "What about the Dragon Emperor himself?" Marcus asked. "If you could speak to him directly, what would you say?" Sarah considered this seriously. "I'd tell him that the Empire is stronger when all its citizens can thrive. That investing in frontier communities isn't charity, it's good policy. And that the best way to understand whether policies are working is to see their effects firsthand." "You think he should travel more?" "I think he should live more," Sarah said. "Not just state visits and official ceremonies, but real engagement with ordinary citizens facing ordinary problems. The way you did today, when you helped me get medical care. That's what leadership should look like." Marcus felt humbled by her words. Here was Sarah, who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, still believing in the possibility of good governance and effective leadership, still giving him credit for basic human decency. As evening approached, Sarah's fever broke completely, and her breathing normalized. The medication was working, and rest was helping her body fight off the infection. "I should let you sleep," Marcus said, standing to leave. "Marcus," Sarah called as he reached the door. Thank you. Not just for today, but for listening, for caring about things that don't directly affect you. It gives me hope that there are still good people in the galaxy. There are more good people than you think, Marcus said. Sometimes they just need the right opportunities to help. Walking back through the station corridors, Marcus reflected on everything he had learned during his 3 days of investigation. The scope of the problems was larger than he had imagined, but so was the potential for solutions. Citizens like Sarah weren't asking for the impossible. They wanted competent governance, fair treatment, and the opportunity to build meaningful lives. The Dragon Emperor had the power to provide those things. But first, Marcus the Freight Hauler had one more task to complete. Tomorrow, he would pay a visit to Station Administrator Knox. It was time to understand how the local governance systems worked and why they were failing so spectacularly. It was time to see if the people responsible for implementing imperial policy had any idea what their decisions actually accomplished. Marcus Chun had spent 3 days learning to see his empire through the eyes of his citizens. Now it was time to start changing what he had seen. The Dragon Emperor was ready to return to his throne, but he would not be the same ruler who had left it behind.